So I just want to start this video off by saying that I don't believe we're in serfdom, and obviously our current political and economic organization is a whole lot better than what it once was in feudalism. But with that being said, I do think there are some comparisons that are worth making to point out some flaws in our current system, particularly the lack of power of the people and the consolidation of power in the ruling class, which is inherently going to be the landowning class and the political class that a majority of us aren't a part of and realistically will never be a part of, despite them being the ones who create the systems in which we live in and to some extent dictate, how we live, which I find concerning. So that's my concession. But now to get into what prompted me to make this video. For context, I am a recent college grad who has luckily found himself a job in an industry that I want to be in. I graduated from a state school. I graduated in 3 years with a STEM degree. I figured if I'm going to get the capitalism certificate, I might as well do it for as cheap as possible and as quick as possible, but something that's like relatively reputable. So that's what I did. I was speed running college. I wanted to save the money and not be a burden on my parents, hence why I chose public over private. And luckily I did not have to take out any loans. My mom worked as an accountant and my dad worked for the MTA, which signals to you that I'm based in New York, which is awesome. I love New York. But they were able to save money for me and I got some scholarship and graduated a year early, so I didn't have to take loans out. So I'm in a very privileged position where I graduated without debt. I'm graduating into a job. Even if this job doesn't work out, I think my degree is pretty strong and I could fall back on it and showcase that I have presumably marketable skills and get myself employed elsewhere. But who knows anymore in this economy? Regardless, there's immense privilege in my circumstances, and I recognize that. And a lot of Americans are not in that position of privilege. But even so, I still feel the boot of the elite class pushing down on the middle class, actively making it worse and actively making it harder for those who are below the poverty line or genuinely poor, lower class individuals, making it near impossible to escape that situation and the cycle of poverty. I see a lot of my peers who are middle class taking on $200,000, $300,000 loans, $200,000, $300,000 loans in order to secure themselves middle class because they were given it for their childhood and they want to get a prestigious job to guarantee it for themselves throughout adulthood. But they're falling for something that I would argue is a facade, that if they get this degree, this certificate, this job, that they'll be able to pay the loans off, right? That whole line of reasoning. But a $60,000 a year job, an $80,000 a year job, even if you get that right out of college, there's still decades of debt that you have to pay off. And even if you get this huge, big paying $100,000, $200,000 a year job, the work-life balance might be brutal, whatever. I'm personally very debt averse, and I don't believe in the fact that an 18-year-old or a 19-year-old should be able to take out $200,000 worth of loans with zero credit just for undergrad alone in some circumstances, let alone the people who want to go to law school or med school, which I'm kind of considering law school, but that's a whole separate video of why I may or may not go. But I think people fail to recognize that the cost of education is increasing, the cost of living is increasing, and wage is not. And you're signing up for loans that you will have to pay off for potentially decades that do not guarantee you a job in this economy. And even if they do guarantee you a job, it's not a job that has a wage that is competitive with inflation and with the disparity that we see going on in terms of like class disparity. So I just find it super concerning that people are taking out hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of loans that are, as far as I'm aware, non-dismissible. Like when you file for bankruptcy, I don't think that student loans get absolved, but I could be wrong. And so the fact that public policy and institutionalism encourages that to 18-year-olds, 17-year-olds, 16-year-olds, people preparing for college with so little knowledge of the economy and the market at scale is kind of disgusting. But whatever. Back to feudalism. I don't think we're being told to live on the land and work for a lord. We're not farming wheat and making our own bread and kicking back the rest of the wheat to the king so he can turn a profit. But let's say you're earning average income and you're doing everything right. You may still be handing over 30% or 40% of your income for rent, paying for something that you'll never own, which is, dare I say, comparable to the whole feudal analogy. This is assuming you don't live with your parents. And I'm in a fortunate position where, despite my very shoddy relationship with my parents, which is like very strained for a variety of reasons, if I was moving out, my income would, like 40 to 50% of it would have to go to rent, even with roommates, which is disgusting. And I would have no money to save because I have to deal with other living expenses. But I am biting the bullet and living with my parents. But I think there's like this big FOMO culturally that you go from college, presumably, where you're living away from your parents, and to like going into the workforce and ideally getting a job so you can move out, so you can live away from your parents again and stay that way and keep that distance. Like I said, I don't have the best relationship with my parents, but I think for the financial well-being of our family unit, it's ideal to make the sacrifice and live at home and not fall for like this cultural trick to move out, especially if you really can't afford it or if it doesn't make logistical sense. Some people argue that like having a fire under your ass encourages you to make more income, but in certain circumstances, you just cannot up your income that fast. And in some of these major cities, like I said, like I'm in New York, it's going to be 40 to 50% of your income on top of other living expenses. And I have no clue that, including a social life and all that, people are actually saving money, or building wealth. I really don't think they are. Obviously, people living paycheck to paycheck aren't, but I think people with lifestyle creep aren't either. And financial literacy is a big problem in America. I feel like my education was pretty good for public high school, but I wasn't really told anything about financial literacy whatsoever, aside from my algebra teacher, who, bless his heart, was talking about interest. And I want to say in like 8th grade, 9th grade, he was talking about compound interest. And he said, if any of you know what's good for you, you'll set up a Roth IRA and the compound interest will benefit you for the rest of your life. And I kind of had a chip on my shoulder because he used to kind of shit on me. Like I did well in class, but we had like this kind of like thing. And it was friendly, but I was like, okay, fuck this dude. I'm going to make my Roth IRA and get up and prove him wrong. And I've been working since 13, 14, just because like I never wanted to be a burden. So whenever I was able to get my working papers, I did. And I didn't contribute as much as I would have liked to my Roth IRA, but it was set up and I contributed a little. But also I was like young and liked eating out and smoking weed and whatnot. But 18, 19, 20, I maxed out my Roth IRA, and it's only because of what he said back then. And I had no formal like financial literacy course or anything like that, and I was not exposed to that knowledge anywhere else, aside from the rabbit holes I've since been in for personal finance that were only encouraged because I've had the habit established before. And it's also like it's coupled with the fact that like I have paranoia as somebody who was given middle class privilege in my childhood, and I want to secure that for myself throughout adulthood, and I want to secure the fact that I won't have to be a drain on my parents' retirement, and also for my own social mobility and for the kids that I may have, and etc. Because I want to have little mini-me's that are fire and do good in the world, and I like community. And yeah, but a lot of these people don't have these saving habits. They don't have this financial literacy. And only when they get a wake up call, when it's too late, or they have a friend put them on, hopefully, and they are convinced and not stubborn, will they learn about this financial literacy. And even if they do, these paycheck to paycheck people, or these people slightly above that, they'd have to be disgustingly frugal to make it work and to be able to save. And as prices go up and we get price gouged more and more as a society, it's going to become like nearly impossible at some point, where a little bit of your paycheck is rent and a little bit of it is expenses. It's hard to have wiggle room to save. And a lot of the times one job doesn't cover it. People tend to pick up another. I have a second job just because, like I said, I'm a speedrunner of capitalism, the whole speedrunning college thing. But, I don't need it. A lot of these people have a second job and they fucking need it. They're working 40 hours a week, for their first job, and on top of that they're working another 20 hours a week, and that's if they're working strictly 40 in their first job, which they might be working more unpaid, which it's horrible just to make ends meet, right? Especially because some of these people are shackled with debt. My income hungriness, just to give you some perspective, I think psychologically it stems from a very pivotal moment in my childhood. I always had a babysitter because my parents both worked in the city. So when I was young, I want to say like third grade, I was playing Dead Island and my babysitter came up to me and was like, "Did you do your homework yet?" And I was like, "No." And he was like, "Okay, do your homework." And I was like, "Fuck." And that interrupted dopamine was very annoying. So my logic was, if I do my homework immediately, I could play video games for the rest of the day. But if I play video games right after school, I'm going to get interrupted to then do my homework, which is a drag. So from that point on, I did my homework immediately, and I was like free time maxing as fuck. So the moment I got to middle school and high school, whenever I was at lunch, I would just do my homework. Whenever I would get a packet in class, I would speed run it because the homework is like the last couple of pages of the packet. So if I could figure out what the lesson is about in 5 minutes, I'm just going to disregard the teacher and speed run the packet. And this obviously continued to college, to speed running the degree itself, because it's going to be the same certificate at the end of the day, regardless if you do it in 2 or 3 or 4 years. And I get to save my parents money and blah, 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 blah. But that's like a capitalist urge that is only conditioned into me because of capitalism, and it's debatably kind of bad. I do appreciate the ambition that I have because of it, but I think it's a little disgusting, and I definitely need to check myself at points. Regardless, though, a lot of these people are income hungry just to make ends meet, or just so they're not drowning in their own debt. And that's where like these finance gurus come, and they take advantage of people, which is horrible. But you know, I'm income hungry because I'm trying to secure a capitalism win for myself and then give back to my community and be in a privileged position to help family and friends and give money to mutual aid groups and whatnot. Also, the fear mongering like bullshit I see in the news every day has definitely, you know, contributed to my paranoia. So I have a second job, but I think like 5% of American workers right now work multiple jobs, which is the highest it's been since 2009, which following the 2008 financial crisis, it's like the fact that we're in a fucking like worse position maybe compared to then is concerning. It might be skewed from the whole overemployed movement, but I do think a large part of it is just retail workers not being able to earn a living wage. I could be wrong, but I don't know. I'd like to see. For Gen Z, I think it's like 45% report having a side hustle just to afford existing. And I do think that people aren't being paid a living wage. Minimum wage federally is around $7 off the top of my head, which is disgusting. And you can make the argument that raising minimum wage is going to raise the cost of living for everything else. And I'm not a macro economist or whatever, so I can't say if that's wrong. But I do think that the price gouging we're witnessing is not due to the cost of labor for the business. I think it's more the cost of paying CEO Christmas bonuses. And I definitely think that's the case. You know, my mom worked as an accountant and she worked her way up the corporate ladder. And in the late stages of her career, some of the bonuses she was getting were just genuinely absurd to witness. And they were nowhere near the bonuses I know that some of the CEOs of these huge mega corporations are taking. But we're constantly witnessing the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And to say that, oh, like if you raise minimum wage $1, like everything is going to go up $1 and it's going to devalue the whole dollar and economy and whatnot. But like disregard the fact that a CEO takes like a $200 million bonus. I think it's just like we're clearly not being told the truth somewhere, and the truth is getting lost. I think that whole argument against raising minimum wage is thus just fucked up and like stupid, and it, like we could afford to raise the minimum wage if the wealthy class weren't such greedy assholes and we taxed them a little bit more. You know, you think of like Elon Musk, who's a single dude who has more wealth than the bottom 50% of America. One person with more power than 165 million people. A person who could spend over $200 million on an election that is foreign to him. Right, our domestic election. But a foreign election to him to guarantee himself a role in the government that never existed before. Like, this shit is getting absurd. You know, it's the type of power that I myself, as an American-born citizen, will never see. And this dude from South Africa who was born to apartheid, like emerald mine owners, was able to just buy that power and that positioning. And I think that's horrible. And I think it's like a mockery of democracy and the whole based Enlightenment thinker, Giga Chad Greek classic ideals that America was built upon. And it's starting to resemble feudalism more and more, and oligarchy more and more. And I really don't think that calling it an oligarchy is fear-mongering. I mean, we have J.D. Vance, who's in the pocket of Curtis Yarvin, basically, via Peter Thiel, who believes that people should be ruled because other people are better than them. And he has this whole dark enlightenment, techno-feudalism, weird fucking thing. And it sounds conspiratory. And it sounds like, you know, like I'm reading a dystopian novel in 6th grade again, but I'm not. It's just headline news, or it's just like actual reality. We have tons of Americans living below the poverty line, and I don't think the rich want to make it so that there are less people living below the poverty line. I think they want to make it so that there are more people living below the poverty line. And it's just not sustainable to work a normal job anymore and make ends meet, at least for a lot of people. And we used to be able to have a single breadwinner, and now that's turned into having to have dual household income, or a dual income household, in order to sustain a family of 4, put a down payment on a mortgage. It's very difficult, especially as cost of living goes up. Home prices are increasing because private equity is buying a fuck ton of houses, and people are treating housing as an investment now. And we're witnessing Medicaid cuts, tax breaks for the rich, SNAP cuts, all that stuff, making it worse and worse off for the average American, the average lower class, middle class American, who is also letting their child take on debt, who already has a mortgage to pay for the house. You know, people are being shackled by these systems and these institutions, and they're not really recognizing it. And there's almost nothing being done. There's no recourse to be had to fight against this like boot coming down from the policymakers. And like I said, like an 18-year-old can take on a $200,000 loan with no credit, which I think is absurd and unheard of throughout history. And you can't even declare bankruptcy and get it away. And, you know, the whole private equity thing, raising the cost of living and like ruining businesses is a whole other conversation, and like just the greed of Wall Street. But like, I wouldn't be surprised if in 5 or 10 years, these motherfuckers tried to like privatize the fire department or something. I think politically we're in like a hellscape. I never would have anticipated that the president would have immunity in any sort. I mean, you could say it's like, oh, it's like actions when he's president. I think that's absurd. I think it's anti-founding father, you know, anti-enlightenment. And we have all this lobbying and all these corporate interest groups and all this like anti-constituent policy work that goes on behind the scenes, where representatives are actively hurting their own people, and people are just voting against their own interests because there's hundreds of millions of dollars of propaganda slop thrown at them on TikTok and Instagram and Facebook. And I'm a victim of it. I'm consuming it. Some of that slop has definitely misinformed me, but I try to read like independent stuff. I try to read boots on the ground stuff. I try to just look at the statistics and make sense of them and not be fed an opinion. But people are working super hard in an economic system built by others that is actively being worsened. And for most of these people, it's, you know, it's impossible. They're drowning. And every single time they get their paycheck, they just respawn at the same spot because half their paycheck goes to rent and the other half goes to cost of living. And maybe they get to make the minimum payment on their debt, but if not, they're in more debt. And it's not the Reaganomics bullshit that we're being spewed, right? These tax cuts for the rich are really not benefiting these people struggling who are shackled with debt. And, you know, we've been known that Reaganomics doesn't work, but to revert back to it's weird. And I mean, even if we weren't reverting back to it, it's not like the economy was in a great spot before. Like I said, like corporate capitalism is just actually collapsing our democracy with these private equity groups buying up single family homes and lobbying against our interests and whatever. And I don't think we're serfs, but I do think some people are living like serfs because of all this, and the system is actively working against them and is actively getting worse. And if this big, beautiful tax bill passes, I fear the country is going to be in a worse off spot. and we're going to be in crazy amounts of debt. Not that we aren't already as a country, but people will genuinely be beyond poor, like in the negative thousands of dollars, and then have on top of that welfare cut. Meanwhile, we spend enormous amounts of our taxes on very interesting things, wealth hoarders have more than they could ever dream of and are practically gamifying society to make it so that they can get as much as possible while destroying the earth. And I just find that all concerning, and I'm definitely grateful to be in a place of privilege, but I wish more people were, and I wish it was easier for a poor person to get out of poverty and for a middle class person to secure middle classness for themselves, and for children in the middle class to not shackle themselves with debt under the guise of getting a high-paying job, not knowing and not running the projected calculations that they're going to have a monthly payment for the next few decades, and like debt looming over them. Like, what if they are unable to work for whatever reason? That debt does not go away. And for some of them, they're going to have to work very, very long weeks. So I find that all very weird and concerning. I do have to point out that I paid for the first few doors in this game, and I was the first one to hit the mystery box, and I got the thunder gun, and I think that is beautiful karmic energy, and I'm just going to end on that.